talk a little bit about materials. Well, where should we start? Because I think we fundamentally look at a watch as we look at a watch case as being the vessel within which the movement sits. But the case itself is an extraordinarily complex and complicated piece of machinery, in effect. In some cases have 18, 20, sometimes up to 30 separate elements. So being able to combine those various materials within a rather complex case construction gives brands the opportunity to explore different aesthetic results. And I think that's why particularly high-end watch brands who have collections that they are able to grow and they want to exceed the limitations of a particular material, are very adept at changing out the materials within collections. And I think that's what gives the customer base the opportunity to choose between a simple iteration in steel, a more complicated iteration in bimetal, going through into what we describe as, I suppose, unique proprietary alloys, such as we're looking at the Hublot Magic Gold here. I mean, brands operate within the confines of a highly specialized industry that is allowed to propagate its own alloys, which they like to name. So Omega have recently launched their own copper gold alloy. So there's a great deal of experimentation that goes on with brands. And I suppose internally, it's almost an element of the competitive set that they are playing with, alongside the ultra complications and other devices by which they add brand equity. The materials that they choose to use and how they use them, and perhaps how they even name their own materials, is part of their competitive set. So that's, I think, primarily why brands enjoy working in a combination of materials.
So that's sort of talks to the uniqueness and the boundaries which the brands push themselves to give a point of difference as well, I suppose, because whilst not all gold is equal, it does give the brand something to test themselves with, I suppose, and then and also offer to the client something that you can't buy with another manufacturer and another brand. Yeah,
I think that's a very good way of putting it. It's a way of making more exclusive, perhaps, a model or a collection that to the common observer might share competencies with other brands. How can you demark your own brand? And materials is obviously a very clear and direct way of flagging your brand against other brands, even when you may be, with respect, sharing calibers that have been produced as part of a group or have been purchased third party. So materials, and we know several brands, and we're used to seeing brands come to market now, and perhaps as we are much more transparent around the role of movements and where those movements originate, but perhaps the movement may sit in other brands' models, but the execution of the case material will be unique to that brand. And I think we've seen that. Well, we've seen interesting confluences between, again, the use of non-traditional materials in watch cases, elevating a brand that has possibly come to market much later than several other brands that has shared the movement that they're featuring. But we should talk a little bit about individual cases, no pun intended. But I think bimetal is a great starting point because, with respect, I think bimetal has been somewhat divisive over the years. I mean, it's rather like that optical illusion where you're looking at a picture and you either see the reclining woman or you see the mountainside. You know, you can't see both at the same time. And I think people look at bimetal. Some will see, in the case of a steel and yellow gold watch, a steel watch that has been slightly pimped up by the advent of gold being attached to it. Whereas other people will see a gold watch that has been sublimated with steel and won't reflect on that as being, well, is that a true gold watch because steel's added? And I feel that's distinctly the wrong way to look at bimetal. You have to look at it in the whole, in the round. Is the design, is the aesthetic attractive? Is that combination attractive? And it sounds bizarre, but I think this slight reluctance to absorb some of the bimetal executions we see reflect as a cultural how would you describe it? It's sort of a cultural affliction which dates back nearly 1,000 years to the rule of tincture, which was the rules by which heraldic devices were first created. And we're talking 900 years ago. I think it was formulated into the rules of tincture several centuries later. But what that stated very plainly was metal shouldn't touch metal. And particularly in those days, they were talking about silver and gold. Silver and gold should not connect. So that was led through, and then there are other rules of tincture around coloration and why certain colors shouldn't sit upon other colors. This was all about trying to create the boldest and obviously the most frightening heraldic device you can come up with. So we won't go too far down the route of heraldry, but the point was, these rules about how you use various metals have existed for nearly a millennium. So when people are discussing whether they like a bimetal watch or don't like a bimetal watch, they're just replicating a conversation that was taking place in the 13th century. So we shouldn't be too worried that we can't make our minds up about bimetal watches. They come into fashion, they go out of fashion. Right now they're back in fashion. And you could ask why are they back? I think there's been a huge amount of interest shown in steel watches, particularly steel tool watches, particularly those created in the luxury segment in the 70s. And the Newtonian laws of physics tell us, every action has a reaction, and the action of being fascinated by steel watches has led to the reaction of people thinking, well, I want to be a bit different. How can I be a bit different? And we've seen, for instance, with a brand like Tudor come to market. I mean, Tudor brought silver back into watch cases a couple of years ago. Silver had been used in watch cases before, but it wasn't something that hadn't been current for about 50 years, I'd imagine, but there has been a few examples. So silver came back with Tudor, and then obviously Tudor launched in bronze, which is a case material that had been used. Panerai had used bronze before, and Tudor, like Panerai, brought bronze back into tool watches that had an association with the sea and seafaring and submarines. So we have this point now where materials are changing to affect a choice in a collection, and for a brand to be able to offer a point of difference when they feel that perhaps the focus is too heavily set in one particular direction.
And namely steel. There's a couple of points there on to touch on the where you were talking about in terms of bimetal. Do you think that in an industry which is, we say it often, we're very lucky to work in this industry, it's not a necessity. There's a lot of conversation about cost of living at the moment.
Yeah.
Do you think that we will see an increase in watches, sort of bimetal, where people are potentially being a little bit more conservative in terms of where their money goes versus a precious metal watch? Because there is a price difference as well.
Yeah.
So you're going up from the steel or down from the mixed metal?
Yeah. I think that's absolutely right. I think we won't talk about the secondary market for obvious reasons, but we're seeing some quite aggressive pricing for steel watches, particularly in the high-end luxury brands, and suddenly a bimetal, and in some cases a full gold watch, is starting to look affordable, or at least very high value for money compared to what is effectively a base alloy steel watch. And I think that is what's focusing people's attentions at the moment. It's like, well, if they're asking that much for a steel watch, what can I find that's not simply steel or only steel? And that is driving interest, I think, in bimetal again, with this sort of cultural moment where we are reflecting a bit more on those, what I called the go-go 80s, and what at the time was seen as an era of freedom, choice, broadening of opportunity. I mean, the 70s have been a very tough decade, and then the 80s came along. We had deregulation of the banking system, which put a lot of money into a lot of people's hands, and suddenly people wanted to explore what that money could do and how they could demonstrate the fact they had it. And actually, that's why we see in a lot of films at the time, we saw Crockett and Tubbs in Miami Vice, you saw the bimetal watch come through very quickly as a real cool identifier of an individual who had money to spend, but as I said earlier, didn't necessarily want to wear a gold watch because that had an inference of something you achieved later in life, or you were handed as you stepped away from your job at the end of your career. Suddenly, here was a watch that had all of the associations of gold, that also had that kind of cool attachments that a steel sports watch, which is effectively what these watches were at the time, came from. So I think you're absolutely right, Faye. I think there's a great deal of interest now in looking outside of what is potentially an overheated market, or indeed slightly overpopulated market, and everyone wants a point of difference. I mean, everyone wants a point of difference if they can find one, particularly if they're investing into a fine mechanical watch. And we all like to have a conversation piece. We all want to have a story we can tell. And I think what we talk about materials, particularly when we come into the more recent material choices, such as ceramic, which first appeared in a watch back in the 80s. IWC, interestingly, used ceramic for the first time in one of its high complication collections, the Da Vinci, which, looking where ceramic went next, is slightly an odd positioning for it. But we talk about ceramic coming through in the 90s, and then in the noughties particularly, we saw carbon come through very strongly as well. And the attributes of those brought a different sort of conversational starter point. But they all served the same purpose. They all created a point of difference.